So the European Union and China, they have already vowed to retaliate. At what point would the administration consider pulling back on tariffs, especially on those 10% across the board tariffs? Where is the room for negotiation?
I don't think there's any chance that President Trump's going to back off his tariffs. This is the reordering of global trade, right? That's what's going to happen. But the world should stop exploiting the United States of America. Let our farmers sell their products. Let our ranchers sell their products.
Welcome to the Nicole Osei Report. I'm Nicole Osei, and today we're going to be breaking down President Trump's escalation of his trade war. He's taken it globally now, and talk about the impact it will have on everyday citizens. And joining me today is UNT Economics Department Chair, Professor Jeffrey Rous. Thank you for joining me again.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
All right. So as we were saying, on Wednesday, a day President Trump deemed Liberation Day, he declared a national economic emergency and announced a 10% tariff across all countries, and even higher tariffs on countries he deemed the worst offenders. I think those are about 60 different countries. Can you first talk about the relationship the U.S. has with other countries in terms of the importing and the exporting of goods before we get into how this is going to impact everyday Americans?
Yeah, well, first, let me just add a little bit of detail to what you said. For the 40 largest trading partners that the U.S. has, so that's the countries that we trade the most with, the average tariff rate is going to be 23%, not 10%. When he talks about the worst offenders, what he's really looking at is the U.S. trade deficit. So if we import $100 billion of goods from a country, but only export $80 billion of goods to them, then we've got a trade deficit of $20 billion. And so the larger the deficit as a percentage of our trade, the larger the tariff, because I think his goal is to try to get our trade deficit with every country to go to zero, so that if we buy $1 of their goods, they buy $1 of our goods. Now, economists think that's a dubious goal. We're not really sure that's really a goal we should be pursuing. But his other goal seems to be to try to bring jobs back to the United States. So I think that's a large part of it. The U.S. trades we import about $3.2 trillion worth of goods from other countries, and we export about $2 trillion of goods to other countries. So our overall trade deficit is about $1.2 trillion per year. So this is fairly massive. We have, like I may have mentioned it, those 40 largest trading partners we have account for 82% of our international trade with other countries. And so this is going to dramatically change our relationship with most of the countries we deal with most often.
Before Trump announced the escalation of the trade war, countries like Mexico, Canada, the European Union, Japan, and South Korea, they had all said that they were going to plan retaliatory tariffs. And from what we've seen in the past leading up to Wednesday in terms of how they retaliated, what can consumers expect to see in terms of goods coming in from those countries? And even possibly if you are in the export business, what can those people expect?
Okay, this is an important question, and it's got a lot of moving parts to it. So if we just look at this on average, let's say for 82% of the trade that the United States has with other countries, there's going to be about a 23% tariff. The administration has made the assumption that prices on imports will go up only about 6%, meaning that importers will absorb 3/4 of this tariff. The research that they're basing that on is very clear that it says that this is only a short run assumption, or a short run finding for this percentage of the tariff that we pass through. In the long run, it's probably a much larger percentage of the tariff we pass through. International trade only accounts for about 12% of GDP. So if 12% of the goods we buy go up in price because of the tariff by 5 or 6%, that might mean inflation might rise 2, 3, 4% because of the tariff. So goods that we buy in the United States, we're going to have an increase in the inflation rate. So that's the first kind of part of this. That's assuming that other countries don't retaliate. And if they do, then it'll be harder for the U.S. to export goods. So this just means that trade, both our imports and our exports, will be reduced. And the goods that we do buy, because we're now producing more in the United States, will be more expensive because we're no longer producing them in countries that produce them most efficiently and cheapest, but we'll be producing more of the stuff in the United States where we're relatively a higher cost producer.
Now, Trump has said that he wants to move production back to the United States. Can you discuss the dynamics of that effort? I mean, we know that there are some things that just don't grow here in terms of produce. So that feat could be just impossible. But there are also products that are made in the United States, but they've got parts coming in from a different country. What's the likelihood that this will happen? I mean, can we really bring back that mass production back to the US in this day and age?
You know, I've just some anecdotal comments I've seen in the media says that a lot of companies say, look, for even a 23% tariff, it might still be cheaper to make goods overseas than in the United States. So, you know, this is really, we haven't seen a increase in tariffs this massive since the Great Depression. And so it's really hard to know and predict how this is going to affect things because it's just such a large change. You know, although it's a completely different thing, economists have found that the minimum wage, if you increase the minimum wage a little bit, it probably won't affect unemployment. But if you were to triple the minimum wage, eventually it starts to have an impact. And I think this is the same thing. If the tariffs were 5-10%, I think we would see very little production moving back to the United States. But the fact that it's much larger than that on average means that we might see some things coming back. But again, it's sort of an interesting thing. If the tariffs work in bringing all this production back to the United States, then we're not going to generate any tariff revenue because we won't be buying foreign goods. If the tariffs don't work, then the production will still stay where it is, but the United States will raise tariff revenue. And so that to me is really the interesting thing. Where in that continuum are we going to fall? And then if we do raise, let's say, $300 billion a year in tariff revenue, are we then going to lower income taxes because we're now generating tariff revenue? But of course, tariffs are like sales taxes in that the lower income folks pay a larger percentage of the tax, whereas income taxes, how we traditionally raise revenue for the government, it's higher income people because of the marginal tax rates step up as you get richer. So it's higher income folks that pay a larger proportion of the tax. So to the extent that we do generate a lot of tariff revenue and use that to fund a tax cut, we're going to just increase income inequality in the United States. And I'm not sure, I may have taken that answer a little bit beyond where you wanted to go, but
no, not at all. White House trade advisor Peter Navarro claims that this will bring in $600 billion in revenue. And I think you were kind of like, touching on this. I was going to ask you if does that math add up? I mean, we know that if this is the trajectory that Trump is on and he stays on it, can that work? But we know that sometimes he may turn on a dime next week or the week after. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that number.
Well, what I did is I with what numbers I could find on the internet this morning, I calculated our total amount of imports, and then by the tariff rate that they put on every country, I've been able to kind of calculate if no production moves back to the United States, if trade remains exactly as it was last year, the tariffs will raise $670 billion of revenue this year. So actually a little bit more than the projected 600 billion. However, if 50% of production or if international trade falls by 50%, then that 670 billion falls to 335 billion. So it just really depends on how much of that production, how much international trade slows down, how much of that production moves back to the United States. And again, with these massive tariff increases, it's really hard to know how much of that's going to happen. And certainly it's not easy to know how quickly that'll happen. Factories have been mothballed, things have been repurposed, workers have gotten jobs in other sectors. And to try to put that genie back into the bottle and go back to the way things were 20, 30, 40 years ago is going to require an adjustment cost. It could take a decade for all of this to finally play out. And that's policy stays in place for the next decade.
And it seems as if this also goes back to our previous conversation in terms of you were talking about some of the factories being mothballed and kind of bringing that back, but we've got people who've now moved into other sectors. We've got machines and AI taking the place of human beings. How much does that factor in trying to bring back that production and then even like boost jobs in that sector where maybe manpower isn't needed as much?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that I wish I had an answer to, because it's just hard to know how quickly things will adjust. I know that in certain parts of the United States, because people who've lost their jobs have tended not to move to where jobs are plentiful, there may be a reserve workforce that in certain parts of the country are ready to go back to work in manufacturing plants. As you said, new technologies, AI are going to make factories maybe more efficient. But it also means that people have better opportunities maybe in other sectors where they've been training in computers and AI and technology. So now they're not going to want to go back to doing manufacturing. There's a lot of real unknowns in all of this.
Can you discuss the ripple effect that this escalation will have on industries across the U.S., whether it be housing or the auto industry, manufacturing? What can we see in the near future if we continue with this trade war?
Yeah, so just let's take a look at Canada, right? We've just slapped a 25% tariff on Canadian goods, and that includes a lot of lumber. That lumber comes to the United States and is used to build houses. So that may drive up the price of houses by 3, 4, 5%. And when that median housing price in the United States maybe is $300,000 or $250,000, a 3 or 4% increase is fairly substantial. So that gets back to that inflation part of that. It also kind of points out that a lot of what we import aren't finished goods that are made in manufacturing plants, but are inputs that we use in the United States to make stuff that we need in the United States. And so the ripple effect of this is going to be, sure, we're not going to want to buy as many iPhones or other finished products, furniture, or whatever from other countries, but it's also going to be harder for U.S. manufacturers to get cheap inputs to make goods in the United States. So I don't know if that's the ripple effect you were talking about, but that doesn't even include the retaliatory tariffs. Once Canada and other countries start imposing tariffs on U.S. goods, now we've got a 25% tariff on them. They put a 25% tariff on us. Total trade collapses, but the balance of payments might get smaller, but just because international trade has fallen and we've got less imports and exports going back and forth. It's really hard to see how this is a win-win scenario. It's much more easy to economists to see this as more of a lose-lose scenario.
And what about the ripple effect in terms of just our standing in the world? Because we've seen that there's some people from other countries that said, I was going to plan a trip to the US. I'm not coming now. We saw when we launched the tariff war against Canada, there were Canadian stores pulling US products off of shelves. So can you discuss how this escalation of the trade war will affect our standing on the world stage?
Good trading partners make good allies. And so when you reduce trade and you try to impose tariffs on other countries and they impose them on you, first you have just less trade going back and forth. You have less cooperation in the marketplace, which leads to less dependence and cooperation geopolitically. So that certainly can't help us. I've long said that Martin Luther King said the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And as an economist, I'm sort of a cynic on that. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the reason that political and individual liberty and the rule of law and justice has grown so much over the last 100 years is that countries that have all those things grow more quickly, and they've dominated countries that have been more dictatorial, autocratic, repressive. And to say that we're going to turn our backs on the free world and become more insular and isolated and reduce our dependence or cooperation with other countries that feel the same we do in terms of human rights and all of those things and social justice, just can't be good for that movement. You know, the real fear is that this becomes a vicious cycle downward, and we return to countries that are always at odds with each other. And, you know, we've had world wars that came out of that type of thinking. So, you know, who knows where this is going to go, but, you know, we know as economists that markets really thrive on trust and cooperation. And in the absence of that, it's usually not a good thing.
And there are definitely people who support this effort. And I was listening to comments by Howard Lutnick, he's our Commerce Secretary, or comments from Navarro. There are people that are championing this effort. And it got me to wondering is, who wins when it comes to these type of trade wars?
You know, history is full of a lot of examples where everybody loses. There really aren't a lot of examples where people win. You know, in the United States, a lot of farmers sell their products. We've called the United States the breadbasket to the world. And so potato farmers send most of their crops to Mexico, or wheat farmers send most of their crops to Asia, and they're going to lose out. You know, I'd like to know, you know, for every manufacturing job, how many agricultural or service work jobs do we lose? So it's hard to see who the winners are. You know, the one place where we tend to use tariffs and impose trade sanctions in other countries is when we want to punish them for being a bad actor. You know, Iraq promoting terrorism around the world, we shut down their economy. Russia invading Ukraine, sanctions were imposed. North Korea with their nuclear program, we imposed sanctions. Cuba, to a longtime adversary of the South, a long-term adversary of the United States, we've imposed sanctions on them. And what these tariffs do is basically impose sanctions on ourselves and all of our friends and allies. So again, it's really hard to see how this can be any sort of a win for anyone involved.
That being said, in your expertise, is this trade war even justified? And what are your thoughts about why the Trump administration may have even taken on this endeavor?
Yeah, you know, there is a real problem in the United States in that manufacturing jobs have left and people are underemployed and they're doing worse than they were before. And the transition to doing something new is very difficult. And this seems, I think, to be the easiest way that some people can think of trying to quickly rectify the situation. But there's very little data to support that this is a winning strategy. So I'm not sure. I think it's just that this is something that people can grab onto. It seems to make intuitive sense if you don't think about all the repercussions. And so I think that's probably why it's risen to the top and become the sort of the policy of choice. Other than that, I'm not really sure. Now, you know, I should say that when I said there were no winners and it's lose-lose, these tariffs really are more of a lose-lose-lose-lose win. There's always somebody with these tariffs who's going to win. For a long time, the United States has imposed high sugar tariffs, or actually we've imposed sugar import quotas. And by not allowing internationally grown sugar into the United States, we've protected the domestic sugar industry in the United States. So consumers in the United States pay about twice as much for regular white sugar, like you have put in your coffee. We pay about twice as much for that in the United States as they do anywhere else in the world, because we limit international trade and U.S. sugar producers are protected and they can charge double what the world charges for sugar. Those sugar plantations, the sugar country, or the sugar producers, they're the ones that make out here, and they do profit from this. So you can see that tariffs on certain products might benefit U.S. producers of those products. You know, if the U.S. auto industry is producing cars in the U.S., they can now charge a much higher price for those cars because consumers don't have the alternative of buying cars from other countries. But that just means that if I pay an extra $20,000 or $5,000 even for a car, that means I have $5,000 less to buy on clothes or entertainment or other things that I might want to do in the United States. So while it might enrich some certain sectors in the United States, overall, it's going to make us all poorer because we're all going to be spending more for the goods that we buy with the same income.
And that being said, for the everyday consumer, we're expected to see higher prices on things. And we saw what happened with the stock market after the announcement. I think the Dow tumbled maybe 1,200 points. What is your advice to the average consumer in terms of what we can do to kind of weather the storm financially, and just what's in the best interest for your average family as this is going on?
Yeah, if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be making moves in my 401k right now rather than talking to you. I think most people are just sort of waiting, taking a wait and see approach to this. People who need money out of their 401k or the stock market to live week to week. If you still have money invested, it's hard to know whether the market has overreacted in the fall in this last couple of days, or if there's still some hope that these policies will be reversed and things might pop back up. It's just really hard to know. In periods of, I really don't want to give financial advice because this is so complicated and there's so many unknowns on this. I don't think there's an easy solution. Inflation might, go from the current 2.5% up to 4, 5, 6%. So, again, your paycheck's not going to go as far. And just so I guess be conservative on your spending and try to produce or try to generate a little bit of a nest egg so that you, for any uncertainty and whatever it causes in the next year or two, you'll be ready to sort of weather that storm. That's really the best advice I can give.
In past trade wars, judging by past trade wars, is there a scenario to where things could get so critical that President Trump may back down from what he has started?
Yeah, I think our previous experience with this president is that he's likely to do an about face and he could repeal this over next weekend. It's really hard to know which direction this is going to go. 98% of economists may think that this is a terrible thing, but there's always that 2%. And if you're gonna find those 2% and follow their direction, I think that maybe what's happening here is he found some people that sort of are advocating this dramatic shock to the system. And if he really digs in his heels, the other thing we know about this president is he likes to double down. He doesn't like to admit fault. So it may be that we're in with these tariffs for the foreseeable future.
Wow, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap there. Again, Professor, as always, thank you for coming on and sharing your expertise with me. And for those of you who are watching and listening at home, let me know in the comments down below, what are your thoughts about this escalation of President Trump's trade war? And what are your concerns about how you and your friends and family may be affected? And if you like this kind of content, news, politics, and current trends, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.